There haven't been a lot of movies about wax museums lately. In the previous century, there were many to choose from. Just to name a few, let's start with 1933 with The Mystery of the Wax Museum. Then in 1953, we got The House of Wax featuring Vincent Price, and it was shown in 3D. Skipping ahead 20 years to 1973 brought us Terror in the Wax Museum, and then we have our movie for this episode, Waxwork in 1988. We'll take a look back at this campy horror film on the next Back to the Feature.
Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
The movie starts in a mansion where some dude straight up murders a guy by shoving his head into a burning fireplace. While the guy's head goes up in flames, the killer breaks into some glass cases, stealing some strange artifacts. Then the credits roll as we watch the guy take a dirt nap face first in the flames. Next we meet Mark, played by Zach Galligan, who is having breakfast with his rich mother. He's just as spoiled as she is, though, as he has their butler prepare his morning coffee and cigarette. As Mark walks off to school, we see his friends China, played by Michelle Johnson, and Sarah, played by the awesome Deborah Foreman, walking to school where they stumble upon a mysterious wax museum that seemingly appeared overnight in their neighborhood. The owner, David Lincoln, played by David Warner, pops up out of nowhere and personally invites them to a private midnight showing, making sure to clarify that they have no more than 6 people with them. That day at school, we meet another friend of the group, Chain-Smoking Tony, played by Dana Ashbrook. China invites Mark, Tony, and another couple to join them at midnight for the showing, and just like that, Mr. Lincoln has his 6th guest. That night, Mark, China, Sarah, Tony, and their other friends arrive at the museum. But before they even get up to the front door, the other couple bails on the evening. Once inside, the remaining 4 are greeted by a tiny weird butler. I mean weird. And tiny. As the group wander through the dimly lit museum, they admire the lifelike wax figures depicting famous horror scenarios featuring some sort of monster or evil person. Now let me just say that the reason these wax figures look so lifelike is because you can obviously tell that they're just actors standing there, standing still. There must not have been money in the budget to create real wax figures. While standing in front of a roped-off werewolf display, Tony drops his lighter over the rope. Nobody is around, so he steps over the rope to pick it up. And as he steps over, he's transported into the setting of the display. He's now outside in the woods wearing raggedy clothes and a crappy wig. Instead of just turning around and going back in the direction he came from, he sees a house nearby with the lights on, so he goes that way. He knocks on the door as he hears howling in the distance, and a voice inside the house tells him to go away, but he enters anyway. The man inside the house talks to Tony like he knows him. He keeps calling him Jack and tells him that he needs to run because there's a full moon out. While Tony steps outside to grab some firewood, we get glimpses of the worst werewolf transformation ever. And when Tony gets back inside, the man is now full werewolf and takes off after Tony. The werewolf bites Tony on the arm just as 2 gentlemen enter the house. One of them has a rifle and the other one has 3 silver bullets. And neither one of them are very coordinated because the first thing they do is drop the bullets. The younger man distracts the werewolf by letting it literally rip him in 2 while the older guy takes his sweet-ass time loading the gun. He finally shoots and kills the werewolf. Poor Tony though, as soon as the werewolf dies, he starts turning into a werewolf himself. So the old man picks up another bullet and shoots him dead. The camera pulls back out behind the velvet rope and the display is now the dead werewolf and the dead Tony. Mark walks up to the display, gives it a brief glance and just moves on. China ends up checking out a display where a handsome vampire is kneeling. One look at the vampire's eyes and the red rope falls to the ground in front of her. And sure enough, she steps forward and disappears into the display. Now wearing a fancy gown, she finds herself in a castle where the vampire is sitting at a large table doing the eye trickery thing again. She sits at the head of the table and is introduced to his other ladies in waiting. After a disgusting meal consisting of steak tartare, she's led to her room for the night. And not once does she stop and think something is completely wrong here. By the time she realizes she's been hanging out with the undead, it's too late. She makes a run for it and even comes across a man chained to a table with most of his leg missing. You can probably guess where the steak tartare came from. While she is arguing with the food dude about what is real, a rat comes feasting on his leg bone, causing him to scream in pain. Surprisingly, she swats the rat away just before one of the vampires finds her. Now this scene goes on a little too long and becomes a bit silly as she ends up stabbing him in the stomach, which just tickles him. At the instruction of Meat Boy, she grabs 2 knives making the symbol of a cross. He then tells her to touch his head with it. She does as she's told, holding the knives to his forehead until it literally explodes. After her first vampire kill, she breaks a wooden chair with a single kick and uses the broken wood as a stake. And now all of a sudden, China turns into Buffy the Vampire Slayer. 3 vampire chicks enter the room and corner her, and it's pure mayhem. China starts getting all stabby with her wooden stake, and blood sprays everywhere, turning all of their white dresses red. Have you ever seen anyone get stabbed by wine bottles? Well, now you have. Those corks must be pretty sharp. Like I said, this scene gets a bit ridiculous. Even more so when the white wine sprays China in the face, cleaning all the blood off her. How convenient is that? She finally makes it out of that crazy scene, only to come face to face with vampire Fabio. After all that crazy shit, she just gives in and is bitten and transformed into a vampire. Back in the real world, her wax figure is now added to the museum display. Sarah's checking out the display of the Marquis de Sade and is just about to step inside when Mark comes up asking where Tony and China are. He broke her out of her trance just in a nick of time. They think Tony and China ditched them, so they decide to leave. The guy China was seeing is pissed because she stood him up. He finds out she went to the Waxwork, so being the jealous suitor that he is, he decides to go there too. While inside, he runs into Mr. Lincoln, who not only shows him the Phantom of the Opera display, but also shoves him into it. When Lincoln turns away from the display, we now see the dude dressed as a London police officer laying dead next to the Phantom. The next day, China and Tony aren't at school and are nowhere to be found. Mark decides to go to the police to report them missing, and while there, he finds out that 13 other people have gone missing from the area in the past 2 weeks. Mark points out that something strange is going on at the Waxwork and he wants the police to check it out. The detective agrees to go check it out, and he and Mark show up at the Waxwork and are greeted by Mr. Lincoln. He lets them in, but will only take the detective back to check out the displays. Lincoln almost shoves him into the mummy display, but the detective decides to leave without looking any further. Back at his office, the detective is poring over the missing persons photos and realizes that they look a lot like some of the wax figures he saw. So back to the Waxwork he goes, leaving his partner in the car while he sneaks inside. He notices China laying in the vampire display, and he steps inside with a knife to see if she's made of wax. He cuts out a piece from her face and puts it in a bag for evidence. For some reason, Mark and Sarah decide to rummage through Mark's attic, looking through his grandfather's old crap. Sarah finds an old book about the Marquis de Sade and becomes transfixed. She gets all hot and sweaty like she's having the vapors. And once again, Mark opens his trap and interrupts her moment. Can a girl have some alone time with her book, Mark? Mark found an old newspaper that talks about a man being burned to death and robbed of some artifacts. He also finds a picture of Mr. David Lincoln as the prime suspect in the murder. Sarah recognizes him as the same man that invited her and China to the Waxwork. She also notices that he hasn't aged at all. Back at the Waxwork, the detective walks right into the mummy display and finds himself in something straight out of Indiana Jones. He helps an old man open an ancient tomb that holds a mummy. The old man removes a scroll from its dead hands and reads it out loud. Something about a dark curse, blah blah blah. Another tomb opens up behind them and a large mummy steps out and starts after them. Stabbing and shooting it do nothing to stop it from coming after them though. Out of bullets and out of luck, the mummy gives him the weakest bitch slap I've ever seen. It then picks him up and drops him in the tomb and shuts the lid on him. Back in the real world, Mark and Sarah go visit Patrick Macnee, who plays Sir Wilfred, an old friend of Mark's grandfather. Sarah tells him the story of the Waxwork and their missing friends, while Sir Wilfred listens closely. When she's done, he explains that Mark's gramps had collected 18 trinkets from 18 of the world's most evil men. He even breaks it down further by asking Mark to break down 18 by 3. That's right, good old 666, the mark of the devil himself. A bit cliche, but whatever. Mark wonders how Mr. Lincoln doesn't look like he's aged at all since then. It's because he sold his soul, Mark. Try to keep up. Let's jump ahead because Mark's a bit daft. The story goes that if you make a wax figure of someone along with something of theirs from when they were alive, you can bring them back to life by feeding them the soul of a believer. Yeah, it's a bit of a stretch, but you work with what you've got. So basically, if he can sacrifice 18 people to these 18 wax displays, then the 18 evil people will come back wreaking havoc on the earth. It will be the dead rising from the grave, Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. It can only be stopped if they burn the waxwork before the 18 lives are all sacrificed. Sir Wilfred sends Mark and Sarah off to save the world, and then he makes a mysterious phone call where he tells someone to tell the others that Mr. Lincoln has been found and that it has begun. That night, Mark and Sarah break into the waxwork, planning to burn it down. Once out among the displays, Mark starts to spread some lighter fluid while Sarah is eyeballing the Marquis de Sade again. When Mark looks up, Sarah is nowhere to be seen, and while he's not paying attention, the two butlers shove him into another display. Sarah is brought in to meet the Marquis and his boss, the Prince. Dressed like Marie Antoinette, she is offered up as a subject to be tortured for their pleasure. But it turns out that Sarah is totally into it. Seems like being a wallflower all this time was a charade. Mark's current situation is anything but a turn-on. He's found himself in a black and white version of the Night of the Living Dead, wandering around a cemetery at night while being chased by zombies. He's the first one to find the exit though, because he was forced into the display instead of being a willing participant. In his escape though, he's right back to dealing with the butlers. While ducking those two, he dives into the same display Sarah disappeared into. Wait until he sees what she's been up to. She's taking the whipping from the Marquis like a champ, but the Prince wants her to suffer and die by the whip. While the Marquis goes back to work, Mark comes in to rescue her, but he's confused when Sarah doesn't want to leave. Worst rescue ever. He figures out how to beat them at their own game. Pun intended, of course. He explains that because he doesn't believe in him, the Marquis can't hurt him. He even hands his gun over to the Marquis to prove his point. And lucky for him, he was right. The Marquis shoots him, but it goes right through like he's not even there. This breaks Sarah out of her trance and he's able to escort her out. Out of the fire and into the frying pan as they come out of the display and run right into Lincoln and the butlers. They drag them off just as a new couple shows up. The woman disappears into the Marquis display while the guy walks into the zombie display. Almost immediately, both displays are updated with wax figures of their new victims. And that's a Yahtzee for Mr. Lincoln. 18 points. Lights start flashing and all the wax figures start coming to life. Even the victims from the displays. That means China, Tony, and the detective. Of course, now Mark and Sarah are trapped in there with them, but before the shit hits the fan, in comes Mr. Wilfred and a mob of people rushing in like the villagers after Frankenstein's monster. It's a crazy free-for-all, and even Mark and Sarah get in on the action of fighting the wax enemies. Dead China even hits on Mark and he almost falls for it. Thankfully, someone stabs her and kills her. There's some funny stuff going on in here, but some of it's pretty absurd. Lots of sword play, gunshots, and finally some fire. It finally comes to a head when Mark and the Marquis de Sade have some sword play in the back room. I know that sounds like a euphemism, but it's really just swashbuckling. From his perch above, Mr. Lincoln watches and seems pretty sure of the outcome. However, Mark seems to be actually holding his own against the Marquis. Before the Marquis can finish off Mark, he gets an axe in the back thanks to Sarah and her crazy lumberjack skills. Mark and Lincoln figure out they have Mark's grandfather in common, and that distracts Lincoln long enough for Sir Wilfred to shoot and kill him. As flames consume the back room, the werewolf comes in behind Sir Wilfred and removes his head. Sarah and Mark escape out the back and the waxwork goes up in flames. They stand across the street and watch it burn. Now you can definitely tell it's just a small model building burning, but hey, it's what they could afford in their budget. Then in the final moments, a single wax hand survives the fire, crawling from the ashes, leaving the possibility of a sequel. The end. Okay, I first saw this movie on Halloween night back in 1988, and I'll admit that my standards were much lower back then, so initially I really enjoyed this movie. As I watched Waxwork again for this episode, I realized that my initial impressions were very forgiving. Some of the scenes were just a bit campy now. I obviously saw this in the theater because I'm a big fan of horror comedies, but I'll admit that I was also a big fan of Deborah Foreman after seeing her in Valley Girl, My Chauffeur, and April Fool's Day. It didn't make much at the box office, but did well enough on video that it got a sequel in 1992, continuing the story from where the original left off. How many of you saw this in the theater? What's your honest opinion of this movie after all these years? If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below to help grow this channel. I appreciate you taking time out of your day and hope you will come back for the next Back to the Feature.
Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.